Welcome to Treading the Veil and to the True Origins of Halloween. Chapter 1. Samhain. To understand the complexities of the modern Halloween, we must first go back to Ireland, long before St. Patrick spread the faith of Christianity during the 5th century. Ancient Ireland was a world steeped in myth, oral tradition, and strange ritual. It was a land of druids and warrior kings, of tribal law and deep reverence for nature, where the sacred and the everyday were inseparable. To ancient people, the seasons were seen as living spirits, shaping the things to come. The Irish believed the land was alive with spirits, gods, ancestors, and elemental forces. Druids were the intellectual elite: priests, judges, healers, astronomers, and poets. They alone preserved lore orally, taught in sacred groves, followed the movement of the sun and the moon, and oversaw religious rites and seasonal festivals. Sacred sites such as hilltops, wells, rivers, trees, and stones were venerated. Like their Anglo-Germanic and Norse counterparts, there was no autumn or spring. The year was divided in two: the dark half, winter, marked by the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, and the light half, summer, marked by the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. The Celtic calendar turned on 4 great fire festivals, each marking seasonal thresholds: Imbolc, Beltane, Lugnasad, and Samhain. The light half of the year begins at Beltane, a time of life and renewal, but ends on October 31st, the first day of Samhain, summer's end, a time when one cycle ends and another darker one, winter, begins. Fueled with ale and ritual feasting, Samhain was an ancient 3-day fire festival to mark the end of summer, the beginning of winter, and the sun's descent into the other world. Celebrated in pre-Christian Ireland, Britain, and France, between the 31st of October and November 1st, Samhain marked the Celtic New Year, a liminal time when the harvest was complete. Cattle were brought in from summer pastures. The spirits of the dead could return to their loved ones, and the future could be foretold. Samhain was a superstitious time when great battles, both physical and spiritual, were waged, and otherworldly beings and wandering spirits needed to be appeased. Every harvest wasn't simply an agricultural task, but a sacred rite, a negotiation between the people and the powers of nature. The Corn Mother, or Grain Mother, Harvest Mother, is a fertility figure found across many Indo-European agrarian societies. She isn't limited to corn in the modern sense, maize, but refers to grain crops like wheat, barley, rye, or oats, what the English once broadly called corn. The Corn Mother is the embodiment of the grain itself, believed to live in the crops and die at harvest in her crone form. The last sheaf to be cut was often treated with reverence as the resting place of her spirit. She represented the mature, nurturing force of the land, tied to abundance, birth, and death. In many places, the last sheaf of grain was plated into a corn dolly, or harvest effigy, kept over winter to bless next year's crops. Sometimes this effigy was ritually burned, buried, or returned to the soil during spring planting, a ritual death and rebirth. Within this spiritual landscape, scarecrows were more than crude guardians against birds. They became vessels for the spirit of the crop. As they stood watch over the ripening grain, some believed the scarecrow absorbed parts of its essence, embodying the soul of the field. When Samhain approached and the final sheaf was reaped, it marked the symbolic death of the land. The fields went fallow. The earth grew cold. It was at this liminal point, as the veil between the worlds thinned, that the scarecrow too was thought to lose its purpose and die, or become haunted. In remote places, villagers would perform burning rites, heaping together the remains of straw men, old scarecrows, and last sheaves, setting them alight on hilltops or in communal fires. This act was believed to release the trapped spirit of the harvest back to the earth or the other world. In some areas of Scotland and Ireland, folklore told of the Hollow Man, a figure made of the final cuttings of grain, dressed in old clothes and set up near the hearth or in the barn. If not properly honored, burned, buried, or destroyed, it was said the Hollow Man would walk at night, seeking warmth, mischief, or revenge for being forgotten. Such customs likely have echoes in Wicker Man traditions, where human-shaped effigies, sometimes associated with animal and human sacrifice, were ceremonially burned. While there's scant direct evidence of human sacrifice in ancient Samhain rites, the symbolic idea remained potent. A ritual death to mark the year's end, embodied in the image of a burning straw figure, half human, half field. Like the Anglo-Saxon Yule, Samhain was a frightening time when the veil between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead was thinnest, and the cold seeped through the gaps, along with the spirits of the dead, and those spirits that were never human. Like Yule, Samhain was a time to commune with the dead, to remember beloved ancestors, but also a time to fear wandering souls and malevolent spirits. Some were ancestors, some were good and playful, while others were cruel and terrifying. Vengeful beings seeking to drag the living to the supernatural world, especially young children. Fires and ancient spells were used to ward off these potentially harmful spirits. To the Celts, mysterious lights seen at night in bogs and graveyards, the visual phenomenon known as ignis fatuus, foolish fire, or hobby lanterns, better known today in English folklore as will-o'-the-wisp, were believed to be wandering spirits, fairy tricksters, or damned souls, luring travelers to their doom. In response, people carved terrifying, grotesque faces into hollowed-out turnips, mangelwurzels, or other root vegetables, placing candles inside to mimic or ward off these ghostly lights. This acted as a spell, a form of protective magic, a guardian to be placed on thresholds, windowsills, or along roads, as spiritual decoys meant to confuse or frighten the dead, or to guide the spirits back to the other world. There was also a belief that wandering souls might take up residence in hollowed vegetables. Summer is the realm of the living. To the Celts, the thought of displeasing the gods and the sun to disappear and never return was a terrifying thought. In winter, the days are short and the nights are long. The leaves and fruits have fallen from the trees and left rotting on the ground. Lifeless trees loom ominously overhead, waiting to snatch unsuspecting souls as they pass by, dragging them from the realm of the living. In October, one can feel the cold biting at their flesh. It is a time of darkness, decay, and human death. The realm of winter belongs to the dead. During Samhain, animal sacrifices were made to the gods for protection and to entice them to bring back the sun. Due to a lack of food throughout the winter, some animals were chosen to be culled, a necessary sacrifice so the others could live. Like the Anglo-Saxon Blut Month, sacrifice month, cattle and livestock were ritually slaughtered, salted, and preserved for the harsh winter ahead. Great bonfires were lit across the land, a crackling prayer upon every hilltop, pushing back against the darkness of winter while enticing the sun to return. Their flames a signal to both the living and the dead, guiding lost souls while keeping darker forces at bay. The chosen animal, often black, would be sacrificed to the gods, their flesh eaten and their bones thrown onto the fires, hence the term bonefire or bonfire. Often black sheep were used for the sacrifice. In ancient times, Druids would gather during Samhain to kindle a sacred fire using birch sticks. From this, every bonfire in the land was lit, and from them every home relit their hearth. which had been put out that night, an act to bond the families of the village together. In Scotland, during the night of Halloween, many Samhain customs have survived, including boys who travel from house to house, asking for wood for the bonfire. When the fire is lit, the boys take turns lying on the ground as close to the fire as possible without getting burned, allowing the smoke to roll over them. Meanwhile, the other boys run through the smoke and jump over him. Like their ancestors, they also take flames from the sacred fire back to their home and walked in every room, the smoke acting as a protection spell. When the bonfire burns down, the boys scatter the ashes on farmers' fields to protect them and, perhaps like their Anglo-Saxon counterparts, to assure new crops in the coming year. Samhain was a time when games were played and rituals were performed in order to predict the future of those gathered, especially with regard to death and marriage. Apples and hazelnuts were often used in the rituals. In Irish mythology, apples were associated with the supernatural and immortality, while hazelnuts were associated with divine wisdom. One of the most common games that has survived into the modern age is apple bobbing. Another involved hanging a small wooden rod from the ceiling at head height with a lit candle on one end and an apple hanging from the other. The rod is spun around and everyone takes turns to try to catch the apple with their teeth. Young maidens would peel apples in one long strip. The peel is then tossed over the shoulder. Its shape was said to form the first letter of the future spouse's name. 2 hazelnuts were roasted near a fire, one named for the person roasting them, the other for the person they desired. If the nuts jumped away from the heat, it was a bad omen, but if the nuts roasted quietly, it foretold a good match. Items were hidden in food, such as cakes. A person's future was foretold by the item they found. Egg whites were dropped in water, and the shapes foretold the number of children they would have. In 18th century Scotland, Wales and Brittany, a ring of stones, one for each person, was laid around the fire. Everyone ran around the circle with a flaming torch. In the morning, the stones were examined, and if any were mislaid, it was said that the person it represented wouldn't live out the year. Like the Anglo-Saxon Yule, the souls of dead kin were believed to cross the threshold during Samhain and visit their loved ones. Feasts and alcoholic drinks were prepared, and an extra place was set at the table for dead relatives. Candles were lit and placed on doorsteps in order to help dead relatives find their way home in the dark. Seeing a spider during the 3 days of Samhain was believed to be a dead ancestor or friend come to visit. Much like today, dressing up, guising, played a large role in the Samhain fire festivals and involved people wearing animal masks and skins to confuse any malevolent spirits that might be prowling the darkness. Hiding behind grotesque masks, the living moved through the night, unnoticed by those who sought to do them harm. In 16th century Scotland, and perhaps much earlier, young men dressed in white robes went house to house with blackened faces, possibly using soot from the sacred fires, reciting verses in exchange for food. As an ancestor to the later trick-or-treating, the ghosts would often threaten to do mischief if they weren't welcomed. The frightening costumes weren't in honor of evil spirits, but to hide from them, to blend in amongst them, to avoid harm. In parts of southern Ireland, during the 19th century, it was customary for a man to cover himself in a white sheet and carry a decorated horse skull, followed by a group of youths blowing on cow horns, traveling from farm to farm. At each farm they sang songs in exchange for food, much like the Anglo-Saxon was sailing, the forebearer to carol singing. If the farmer donated food, he could expect good fortune in the coming year. But if he refused, then he could expect great misfortune, probably by the locals they offended. Playing pranks at Halloween is recorded in the Scottish Highlands as far back as 1736 and was also common in Ireland. At its heart, Samhain is an ancient three-day fire festival, infused with alcohol and feasting, marking the harvest, the end of summer, and the beginning of winter, a liminal time of wandering spirits and returning loved ones. It would later evolve into the modern Halloween, a patchwork of different cultures and religions, old-world superstitions, and American commercialism. Please note, these chapters are taken from the book The True Origins of Christmas and Halloween by R.G. West, available now on Amazon. Chapter 2. Roman Festivals. Pomona, the fruitful spirit of the orchard. Pomona was a Roman goddess who watched over orchards, fruit trees, and the ripening bounty of the land. Though she lacked the thunder of Jupiter, Pomona held a power more intimate, the slow magic of fruit, the promise of renewal, and the mystery of ripening things. Her presence was felt in every apple tree, pear grove, and vineyard. Her name stems from the Latin word pomum, meaning fruit. She wasn't a goddess of grain or wild plants, but of cultivated abundance, cared for trees and harvests born of patience. Unlike most Roman goddesses, Pomona had no Greek equivalent. She was uniquely Roman, practical, rooted, and close to the soil. She was the spiritual protector of gardeners and orchard keepers. She was depicted holding a pruning knife, a symbol of her care and control over the growth of trees. This wasn't just agriculture. It was a sacred art. In a world where food was survival and the land was life, Pomona represented the divine order behind cultivation. She reminded the Romans that growing and ripening of fruit requires attention, skill, and respect for the seasons. Though Pomona had no grand public festivals, some sources suggest that private rites and rustic celebrations may have honored her around late summer and early autumn during the harvest. Offerings of fruit, nuts, and wine were made to ensure fertility for the next growing season. In later centuries, Pomona was subtly woven into folk harvest customs, and, in medieval times, her spirit lingered in traditions like apple bobbing and orchard blessing. Some scholars speculate that Pomona's legacy may have influenced the Roman roots of Halloween, especially as Roman festivals like Feralia and Lemuria merged with local Celtic traditions. Her association with apples and autumn may echo in Halloween customs, particularly those that celebrate harvest, abundance, and the thinning boundary between seasons. Parentalia and Feralia. When the chill of February gripped ancient Rome, and the veil between the living and the dead thinned, the Romans gathered to honor their ancestors in a festival known as Feralia. Feralia was a solemn and eerie day of remembrance, appeasement, and whispered rites beneath the open sky. It was the Roman Day of the Dead. Feralia was observed on February 21st, the final day of the ancient Roman festival of Parentalia, a 9-day period dedicated to ancestral spirits. While Parentalia was largely private, centered on family altars and quiet offerings, Feralia was the public climax, a time when the entire city turned its gaze toward the dead. It was a day to visit tombs, make offerings of wine, flower garlands, grain, and salt, and speak the names of the departed aloud. It was a time to remember the dead or suffer their wrath. Unlike other Roman festivals full of joy or triumph, Feralia had a darker, older feel. It wasn't a time of celebration, but of solemnity, superstition, and ritual protection. It was common for humble gifts to be laid at the graves of loved ones. According to Ovid, in his poem Fasti, 8 AD, when the Romans forgot to honor Parentalia and the day of Feralia, the spirits rose from their graves and wandered the city, howling and shrieking, demanding their due. Ovid also tells a strange tale set on Feralia, of a crone who, under cover of darkness, performs necromantic rites to banish a restless spirit. She places black beans in her mouth and makes secret offerings to silence the ghost. This folkloric detail reveals how Feralia blurred the line between ancestral veneration and witchcraft, between sacred ritual and supernatural fear. Beans, long associated with the souls of the dead in ancient Roman and Greek belief, were used to lure or distract spirits. Like modern Halloween customs, Feralia combined the ritual feeding of the dead with protective magic. To the Romans, forgetting the dead was dangerous. Feralia was a grim reminder that memory isn't for the benefit of the living alone. The dead need it too. As the Roman Empire became Christian, Parentalia and Feralia began to fade. Its rites were too close to necromancy, too heathen for the emerging church. But its legacy echoed in Christian feasts like All Souls' Day and in folk customs that honored the dead in early spring and late autumn. Lemuria. In the heart of ancient Roman religious life, few festivals captured the anxiety of the living more than Lemuria, the Roman festival of the restless dead. Observed annually on May 9th, 11th, and 13th, Lemuria was a domestic ritual centered not around the grand temples or public altars of the Roman state religion, but around the quiet, shadow-haunted hearths of private homes. It was a time when the veil between the living and the dead was believed to thin, and the lemures, restless, malevolent spirits of the unburied or improperly mourned, could return to haunt the household. It was during Lemuria homes were exorcised through ancient rituals. The head of the household would perform rites at midnight, including tossing black beans behind them and chanting to appease the spirits. It reflected Roman fears of malevolent ghosts and was part of their broader ancestor veneration. The transformation of the Roman Empire from a polytheistic pagan civilization to a Christian one was a gradual but profound shift that reshaped Europe's religious and cultural landscape. This process unfolded over the 4th and 5th centuries, marked by decisive events and imperial policies. Under Emperor Theodosius I, Christianity was declared the official state religion with the Edict of Thessalonica in 380. Only Nicene Christianity was permitted. All other forms of worship, including traditional Roman paganism, were banned or marginalized. As a result, pagan temples lost funding, sacrifices were outlawed, and Christian doctrine began shaping law and imperial policy. In 391 to 392, Theodosius issued laws that banned all pagan rituals, closed temples, and ended the ancient Olympic Games, held in honor of Zeus. The Christian cross had now replaced the imperial eagle and the old gods of Rome. To appease the people, many rural festivals were absorbed into the Christian calendar, such as Lemuria, which was later replaced by All Souls' Day. Chapter 3. All-Hallowtide. In 609 AD, Pope Boniface IV consecrated the Pantheon in Rome to the Virgin Mary and all Christian martyrs, establishing May 13th as the Feast of All Saints, a day to remember the honored dead, especially Christian saints and martyrs. The date wasn't a coincidence, but an attempt by the authorities to replace the Roman festival of Lemuria. In 835, Pope Gregory IV moved All Saints' Day to November 1st, aligning it with Samhain, the Celtic festival of the dead. The day before was called All Hallows' Eve, or Hallowed Evening. These dates were followed by All Souls' Day on November 2nd, a time to pray for those Christians who had committed sin and whose souls are now trapped in purgatory. Together, in England, these 3 dates are called All-Hallowtide, or Hallowmas. In the 8th century, the term All Hallows begins to appear in early medieval English texts as a reference to All Saints' Day. The term All Hallows' Eve is first mentioned in England in 1556. The word Halloween, meaning All Hallows' Evening, dates to 1745. The word hallow comes from the Old English halga or hallig, meaning holy or saint. One of the first recorded formal observances of All Souls' Day was in 998, instituted by Saint Odilo, abbot of Cluny, France. He ordered all Cluniac monasteries to observe November 2nd as a day of prayer, almsgiving, and masses for the dead. This practice spread rapidly across Western Christendom. In Catholic doctrine, purgatory is a state of purification for souls who have died in God's grace, but still carry temporal punishment for sin. On All Souls' Day, the faithful pray for these souls to aid their journey to holy rest. Prayers, requiem masses, and acts of charity are offered on their behalf. It's a solemn, reflective day, distinct from the joyful celebration of All Saints' Day, which honors those already in heaven. Souling. In the 13th century, documented references to souling begin to appear in medieval Europe, especially on All Souls' Day, November 2nd. Bells were tolled for the dead, and much like the Roman Feralia, people would visit cemeteries to tend graves and light candles. Soul cakes were baked and given to the poor or to soulers, children or beggars, who went door to door singing and praying for the souls of the dead, who were trapped in purgatory. Soul cakes were often round, spiced with nutmeg or cinnamon, sometimes marked with a cross, symbolizing the souls being prayed for. While adults sometimes took part in souling, the most visible and persistent participants were children. Over time, they began to guise, to dress in simple costumes or masks, often representing ghosts, saints, or animals. The guised children were thought to represent the wandering souls of the dead, or perhaps even spirits seeking rest. Guising made the ritual more memorable and magical. Children would sing, recite rhymes, or act out little plays for their cakes. As with later Halloween customs, disguises offered a sense of freedom and sometimes mischief, especially when tricks were played on stingy households. These children weren't merely beggars, they were ritual figures, walking the liminal space between the living and the dead, echoing older heathen customs of masked seasonal processions. As the centuries passed, souling faded, especially after the English Reformation, which discouraged prayers for the dead. But the tradition lingered in rural England, and when Irish and English settlers arrived in North America, they brought with them fragments of the custom. Guising. Soulers often disguised themselves, wearing old rags and blackening their faces with soot, or wearing masks to hide their identity, especially in rural areas of Britain and Ireland. These practices often took place in October or early November, around the time of the harvest and All-Hallowtide. Blackening their faces with soot, charcoal, or burnt cork was done to impersonate wandering spirits or supernatural beings believed to roam during this liminal time, and to avoid recognition while engaging in activities like begging or playful pranks. In many areas, especially northern England, children would dress up as ghosts, skeletons, saints, or even wild creatures. The disguises were to represent the dead, or spirits of the departed. This form of guising shares deep similarities with both Samhain traditions in Ireland and Scotland, and later Halloween customs. Mumming. In regions like Cornwall, Cumbria, and Northumberland, older seasonal customs, including autumn bonfires, spirit warding, and mumming or guising, persisted well into the medieval period. Mumming involved bands of men wearing animal hides or turning their clothing inside out, moving from house to house, demanding food, beer, or coins. They would wear animal masks, skeleton faces, or demonic visages as they enacted threshold rituals, crossing boundaries between social roles, life and death, sacred and profane. They paraded through the streets during winter festivals, especially during liminal times like Yule and All-Hallowtide. The masked men performed short dramas involving death and resurrection, often with comic or grotesque characters like devils, doctors, and fools. Sometimes they would enter houses to dance or play dice in complete silence. Its origins are so old they cannot be traced. The word mumming may come from the German word mummy, meaning mask or masker, or the Greek mummo, meaning frightening mask. Echoes of this custom are still felt in modern Halloween, where children dress as ghosts, monsters, or ghouls and wander from door to door. By the 19th and 20th centuries, mumming declined under church opposition and urbanization, but its spirit lingered and re-emerged in Halloween, now a global festival rooted in the very same instincts. Mask, mock, invert, beg, perform, rebel, and confront the dead. Masquerades. Long before the glittering balls of Venice or the elegance of 18th-century French courts, masquerades in Europe had deep roots in ritual, folklore, and the fearsome turning of the year. Behind the masks and costumes lay ancient customs of chaos, inversion, and transformation. Rites meant not merely for entertainment, but for survival and spiritual negotiation. Skeleton costumes were worn with skull masks, playing out mock funerals or ghostly processions. Across medieval and early modern Europe, seasonal masquerades were tied to liminal moments, especially during the end of harvest, All-Hallowtide, and midwinter. These were times when the world was turned on its head, peasants dressed as lords, men as beasts, and the living as the dead. The mask became a license to transgress, to speak forbidden truths, to frighten and to protect. In alpine regions, the terrifying Perchten processions saw masked figures driving out demons with clanging bells. In Germany, the Fastnacht Carnival featured grotesque wooden masks and chaotic parades meant to chase away winter. In Venice, the famous Carnival allowed every class to mingle and misbehave under the protection of anonymity. These masquerades often borrowed from ancient pre-Christian customs, fertility rites, funerary parades, and midwinter sacrifices. They were linked to ideas of the world turned upside down, a momentary collapse of order to renew it afresh. Masks weren't just playful, they were spiritual tools, disguises to fool spirits, or to embody them. Some scholars link these traditions to older death cults, or even early forms of mumming and guising, customs that later influenced Halloween. European masquerades were never just about fun. To wear a mask was to cross a boundary, to speak with the dead, to become a ghost, to mock fear itself. Chapter 4. The Black Death. In the autumn of 1347, death arrived in Europe aboard ships docking at the Sicilian port of Messina. The crews were already dying, feverish, delirious, and covered in blackened buboes. They had brought with them one of history's most devastating pandemics, the Black Death. Over the next 5 years, the plague tore across Europe with terrifying speed. By 1352, it had killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, 1/3 to 1/2 of the continent's population. No war, famine, or natural disaster had ever claimed so many lives so quickly. Between the 14th and 18th centuries, Europe suffered repeated outbreaks. Death would come so quickly and in such high numbers, there wasn't always time for proper funerals or religious rites. Priests and monks, overwhelmed or dead themselves, couldn't keep up with the bodies piling in homes and in the streets. Entire families perished in silence. The dead were buried in haste. Large communal graves, known as plague pits, were dug outside city walls or in abandoned fields. Corpses were thrown in by the dozens without coffins, prayers, or ceremony. Without the final rites, confession, absolution, and burial according to church tradition, it was believed that many souls couldn't find rest. These unblessed dead were said to wander, unable to cross into the afterlife, becoming lost spirits that lingered near the places where they had died or buried. In the minds of the living, the plague hadn't only filled the ground with corpses, but loosed the souls of the dead upon the world. These weren't peaceful ancestors, but restless, malevolent souls. Danse macabre. In the waning light of autumn, when leaves decay and the earth prepares for winter darkness, a shadowed tradition emerged from the bones of Europe's medieval past. The dance of the macabre is a ghostly procession that binds the living and the dead in a shared, inescapable rhythm. Originating in the late 14th century, in the wake of the Black Death, the dance of the macabre spread through Catholic Europe, appearing in murals, poetry, sermons, and theatrical processions. The image was always the same: death personified as a skeleton or decaying figure, leading people of every station, pope and peasant, emperor and infant, dancing into the grave. This was no mere frightful fantasy, but a public meditation on mortality and humility. In a time of plague, war, and spiritual uncertainty, it served as both a warning and a comfort. Death is the great leveler, but also the great unifier. Much like mumming and guising customs, participants adopted otherworldly or frightening appearances, such as skeletons, ghosts, or figures symbolizing death. This act of transformation allowed a temporary crossing of the ordinary world into the realm of the supernatural. The danse macabre, mumming, and guising are intertwined cultural practices that explore humanity's complex relationship with death through art, performance, and ritual. While the danse macabre is a solemn reminder of mortality's inevitability, mumming and guising bring a playful, communal energy to these themes, blending fear and festivity. Together, they reflect enduring human attempts to confront death, celebrate life, and foster community through storytelling and symbolic performance. Churches and cemeteries were adorned with grim artwork. Public performances of the dance were sometimes held in town squares or monastery courtyards. The message was clear: prepare your soul, for death dances ever nearer. Danse macabre imagery became especially prominent during times of plague and death during liminal times, such as All Souls' Day, November 2nd, the Christian day for remembering the dead, and midwinter festivals, Christmas, paralleling when mumming and guising traditions were often celebrated. In Bavaria and other Catholic regions, Dance of the Dead performances or art could be seen around October 31st. Chapter 5. Halloween. When the English Puritans crossed the Atlantic in the 17th century to build their city upon a hill, they brought not just their Bibles, but a deep suspicion of merrymaking, folklore, and all things popish. Halloween, with its roots in All Hallows' Eve, pagan Samhain, and Catholic ritual, was a prime target for erasure. To the Puritan mind, Halloween wasn't harmless. It was heresy in disguise. They viewed it as a pagan relic wrapped in Catholic superstition, completely unsupported by Scripture. And anything unscriptural was, to them, the devil's work. The Puritans tore down holy days and saints' feasts with a righteous fury. All Hallows' Eve, Christmas, Easter, and May Day were swept away with disgust. The Old English calendar, once filled with ghost stories, bonfires, and guising, was replaced by sober days of fasting, prayer, and toil. Even the graveyard traditions, so closely tied to Halloween's ghostly mood, were stripped of symbolism. Death was no longer a time for folklore or remembrance, but a stark reminder of damnation or salvation. In New England, Halloween disappeared entirely for generations. No jack-o'-lanterns, no mumming, and no soul cakes, just long, quiet nights, and a God who watched sternly from above. Yet Halloween wouldn't stay buried for long. Writers like Robert Burns helped preserve and romanticize Halloween in poems like Halloween, 1785, which was widely read throughout the Victorian era. Later in the 19th century, Halloween began to appear in magazines, almanacs, and children's literature. The Victorians celebrated Halloween and were fascinated with tarot cards, romanticized folklore, spiritualism, the occult, and the macabre. To the Victorians, Halloween became a prime time for table rapping, Ouija boards, and seances to contact the dead. In 19th century Britain, Scotland, and Ireland, Halloween was a lively folk holiday, filled with ghost stories, guising, divination rituals, apple bobbing, and autumnal gatherings. However, in England, Halloween was more subdued, overshadowed by Guy Fawkes Night on November 5th. But it still lingered in rural areas and among certain communities, such as Somerset and Norfolk, with the celebration of Punky Night. With the arrival of Irish and Scottish immigrants, America saw the old traditions stir once again. For decades, it remained a localized, somewhat rough folk holiday, mostly celebrated in small American communities. By the late Victorian era, especially in America, Halloween began to include masquerade balls, children's parties, and costume wearing. In time, these traditions started to slowly migrate back to Britain. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, it sent shockwaves through every aspect of American life. Unemployment soared and social unrest grew. Halloween pranks, once seen as harmless, turned into destructive riots in some areas, as desperate or angry youths used the holiday as an outlet, transforming Halloween into a night of terror, mischief, and mayhem. The day before Halloween, October 30th, came to be known as Mischief Night in the United States, except in Detroit, where it became infamous in the 20th century for widespread vandalism and arson, and was better known as Devil's Night. While Halloween has always carried associations with misrule, Devil's Night took that to a more destructive level. Teens and adults began engaging in acts of violence and vandalism, soaping or breaking windows, toppling outhouses, removing gates, even setting fires. Newspapers from the 1910s to the 1930s are filled with headlines describing Halloween mischief gone wrong. It became a holiday of inversion, where the rules bent, especially for the poor or powerless, echoing medieval traditions like the Feast of Fools, where lower classes mocked the powerful for a day. In some cities, gangs of boys, their identities hidden in homemade masks and costumes, would roam the streets, causing damage or demanding food, money, or alcohol in exchange for not causing trouble, echoing ancient accounts of fairies playing tricks on humans. During the Great Depression, these pranks intensified, as economic hardship left communities frayed and tensions high. Fires, smashed streetlights, and property destruction became so common that some cities debated banning Halloween altogether. In response, by the 1930s and 50s, communities, schools, and civic groups began to encourage structured, safe alternatives, such as Halloween parties, parades, costume contests, cornfield mazes, home decoration contests, and house-to-house trick-or-treating, with the focus on candy, not tricks. This shift transformed Halloween from a night of vandalism and adolescent rebellion into a child-centered celebration. In the post-World War II era, when sugar rationing ended and suburban neighborhoods provided the perfect backdrop for child-centered festivities, Halloween became more mainstream. Costume companies began mass-producing disguises, candy manufacturers branded themselves around the holiday, magazines published guides for Halloween parties, Hollywood films like Dracula, 1931, and Frankenstein, 1931, reinforced Halloween's spooky atmosphere. It was in this era, too, that the witch took her modern shape. Stripped of her ties to real persecution, the witch became a mascot of the macabre, a blend of fairy tale hag and cartoon villain, complete with broomstick, warts, and pointed hat. Her image was stamped on decorations, posters, and candy boxes. What had once been a figure of terror was now a smiling caricature on a candy wrapper. The American Halloween is a patchwork holiday, not entirely pagan, nor entirely Christian. It's a holiday stitched together from ancient European pagan customs, Catholic feast days, immigrant traditions, and the shifting cultural winds of an industrializing nation. By the 20th century, America had commercialized and exported this repackaged Halloween back to Britain and Ireland through Hollywood films, TV, and marketing. By the 1980s, trick-or-treating and American-style decor had taken root in the very lands where the festival began. Before you knew it, English children were walking around on Halloween night, dressed in rustling black bin bags, wearing plastic masks, saying "trick or treat" at strangers' doors in exchange for American candy or British pennies. To this day, the older generation think of Halloween as an American nuisance, rather than an old British and Irish folk custom to honor dead relatives and to appease or hide from malevolent spirits. But know you know the true origins of Halloween. Thank you for watching. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more videos.